The Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with a towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him,
Lord, are you going to wash my feet?
And Jesus answered,
You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand.
You will never wash my feet.
Unless I wash you, you shall have no share with me.
Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head.
One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you.
for he knew who was to betray him. And for this reason he said, Not all of you are clean. And after he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them,
Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Now, the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Judeans, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Well, tonight's reading, we hear these same three readings each year. First, we hear on Monday, Thursday of the Passover. The Passover is a meal of liberation and salvation. And next we hear a similar meal, a meal that Jesus had with his disciples, a meal that you and I, we partake in at this table. And then we hear in the gospel reading a story of how Jesus recalled the command given to his disciples again at another meal. Now, as we heard, this meal in the gospel reading, it's not the Passover Seder, but nevertheless, much like the Passover lamb is slaughtered, Jesus too knew that his hours were numbered. And at the same time, he also knew that Judas was about to play a role in those final moments. And the way that John's gospel described it was that, quote, the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but just to be clear, the devil isn't this otherworldly kind of creature with pitchfork and horns. Rather, what John is trying to say here is, John is saying that the devil is the personification of evil. And by personifying it and giving it a name, well, this kind of helps us recall that sometimes evil can take on and kind of have a mind of its own. It can seem to operate and lurk and move through this world in unexpected ways. You see, in today's reading, in tomorrow's passion story, and in the moments of the resurrection, in the early church for thousands of years, in this particular moment that we are in, and in the time that will go on after our lives have ended, you see, in all of those experiences, all of this, what will underscore how we live in the world and how the world operates is how Jesus will respond in this reading to that personification of evil. You see, everything in John's gospel, everything will return back to the moment that we read tonight, to this moment, to this meal, to this night, gathered around with his disciples. And because of how important this meal, this moment is, I want us to just imagine it for a moment. Let's enter that scene for just a moment. Imagine that you are in the room with the person who started the train down the track that will ultimately be your death. You're gathered in the room with this person. Now, there's nothing that can be done to prevent what is about to happen. You can't stop this train from roaring, so your demise is coming. It's kind of a depressing scene, but that's tonight, a little depressing. And in that moment, since that outcome is set, some of us might want to seek revenge, right? After all, right there in the room is that SOB that is going to ruin you, that is going to kill you. Some of us, sitting there in the room, well, we might begin to think about how we could make that narc pay. Just make him pay so that he might feel just a little bit of the struggle and the death that is about to come, that some kind of justice might be served to Judas. We, sitting there, might think how we can just make Judas suffer just a little bit so that he can pay for what he's about to do. And while you and I, at least I, hope that I never find myself in the situation where my life is at stake and I'm looking at the person who is going to cause that, sitting right there in the room, well, my hunch is that if we really thought about our lives, that at some point in our lives, we would seek revenge. Now, even if it is just wanting to get even with that person at work who constantly makes us look like a fool and challenges our every thought, or to force some respect from a family member who always seems to undermine our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences at every Easter and Christmas meal. Or to really finally show that stupid neighbor who cannot seem to park their car in the right spot, or throw the trash in the right bin, or keep it down at 2 a.m. when I'm trying to go to church the next day. Just want to give it to them a little bit, put a nasty little note on their door, and remind them of what they're doing. You see, it's in those simple situations, those easy situations, that it's so common for us to want to seek revenge, to really show that person. Yet tonight, Tonight, when Jesus, who I would say has every right to inflict some kind of pain on Judas, to say something snarky, to throw him under the bus. Well, here, Judas is treated differently. You see, instead, in that moment, Jesus took on the role of the lowliest of slaves. There, he washed the disciples' feet. There, Jesus took a traitor's foot into his hands. And he washed those SOBs' feet. He dried those jerks' feet. And instead of getting even with Judas that night, Jesus instead upended the social order. Jesus flattened the social hierarchy. He took on the role of a slave. He stooped down so that he could stand up and preach egalitarianism. You see, he taught us how to respond when our human nature leans, pushes us, and pulls us towards revenge towards the other. It's almost as if Jesus said in those moments, when they go low, we go high. You see, for Jesus showed that love is the answer. And so too in that moment, Jesus said, do this same thing as I have done for you. And friends, that is what tonight is all about. Tonight, we are told to love one another without exception, even when it feels completely uncomfortable and self-sacrificing. Tomorrow we will hear a different story. Tomorrow we will hear of how the world responds to threats, how the world will take those whom it disagrees with and executes them, how it will silence those who dissent. And even in the midst of tomorrow, we will remember the story of tonight. Tonight, where Jesus' message of love will remain the same tonight and tomorrow and into the future. You see, while this world that we live in, it often tells us that loving and serving, that is for the weak. That is for the spineless. You see, tonight, we've already seen the truth that Christ puts before us. The truth that it is in serving that we are so often freed of the grudge and the sense of revenge. That loving is the pathway to resurrection. And so, friends, as we gather in these next few moments at the wash basin, at the table, I hope that we continue and push through today's journey into tomorrow's and into the graced Easter Vigil. For as we continue in that 3-day journey and beyond, I pray that we might learn to serve. I pray that we might learn to love. And ultimately, my prayer is that we might learn to live the way of Christ. Amen.